Now, think about the city-state versus the nation. The nation is a relatively recent development. 2,000 years ago, we had the Roman Empire. When did modern Italy become a notion? Not till the latter half of the 1800s. So the nation-state, a relatively new idea compared to things that were like Rome. Okay, so that's the first example that shows this transition framework makes a bit of sense. Let's try the economic basis for various kinds of civilizations. Hunting and gathering. Tribes hunted and gathered for tens of thousands of years. Nothing much changed. All of a sudden, as I mentioned earlier, settled agriculture appears. Now, settled agriculture didn't appear overnight, it didn't appear in a decade, it didn't appear in a century, but it appeared in a number of centuries, and compared to the thousands of years that came before, that's an S-shaped break. Similarly, industrial activity. The Industrial Revolution started in approximately the 1820s, the historians tell us. That's when we could first see industrial activity affecting the way our economy looked. But how could it occur then? Why were there people around who could be the workers then? Why was it possible to free up the capital that was needed? Where do you sell the goods? All of that occurred during 1,000 years. And so if you go back to about the year 1000, you can begin to see the changes which 800 years later permitted the Industrial Revolution. Let's try communication. So in each of these eras, you have a very, very different form of communication. Language in the first, writing in the second. So for most of the historical period, everything that we had in the way of a library, everything that we had in the way of a book was handwritten. All of a sudden, printing appears. Extremely different. Once you're into the printing era, orders of magnitude more access to written materials. Now the internet. I would claim another of these incredible breaks, another of these incredible jumps from one level to another. So again, a transition. All of this is really a build-up to talking about what's going on now. The basic argument that I want to make to you today is that something comparable to the shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture is upon us today, and the only difference is how fast it's occurring. Moreover, I want to make the argument to you that it's happening even faster than we might think. So you might put the beginning of a planetary era, the era of globalization, right after World War II with the United Nations. That's one place to put it. The UN is a convenient stake in the ground. It indicates a level of organization that had predecessors but was different from all its predecessors. So that's a start. The Apollo space flight, that picture of the blue globe, people had a concept of the world as a single place with a quality and a visual image that never existed before in the history of mankind. And they thought of themselves as being part of the globe rather than a part of Italy or the United States or Canada or 1,000 years before Rome. I want to argue that really what's going on has occurred after that. That is, in the 1980s. And I want to give you just a few indicators of the remarkable changes we've seen in the last 20 years or so. Global environmental change, the ozone hole, something which is truly global, which we dealt with in a global fashion, greenhouse gases, another global issue that we're not quite dealing with as well as we dealt with ozone. Information technology, I've talked about that. The cell phone for me is the key device, not because I like cell phones. In fact, I don't like them. I was barely convinced to buy one. But what I recognize is if you have a technology that comes along 20 years ago, and now something between a half and 3/4 of the people on the planet have access to it, you're talking about a kind of globalizing change that's never been seen before. There are various other political changes and social and economic changes. I'm a mathematician by training, but I'm an economist by avocation. I think that the economics gives us the strongest feeling for how the world is changing. And it's changing in ways that I actually find both amazing and somewhat frightening. So in my lifetime, I was around in 1950. This may shock you to hear this, but I was. Anyway, since 1950, the global economy has experienced 90% of its historical growth. If you go back 2,000 years, as economists have, you can reconstruct a measure of global GDP, real global GDP, goods and services. So you can get a sense of how big the global economy was basically through most of recorded history. It reached 10% of its current size in roughly 1950. It reached 2/3 of its current size in roughly 1990. The other third occurred since 1990. I bet everybody in this room was here in 1990. So all of you have experienced 1/3 of all of the historical growth the world has ever seen in its economy. I devised a little example to just put this in human terms. So imagine that you run into a friend and the friend's son, and you last saw the friend's son 3 weeks ago on his 10th birthday. And on his 10th birthday, the son was 4 feet tall. If that child grew like the global economy, 3 weeks later, he would be 6 feet tall. Can you imagine what your reaction would be if you ran into a person who grew 2 feet in 3 weeks? That's what the global economy has done. One of the few things that's grown significantly faster than the global economy is global trade. So that's where we are. We're in the middle of a period where things are happening, not just in people's lifetimes, but in small fractions of people's lifetimes, which completely alter the state of global communications, economics, politics, etc. And we're asked to think about the next 50 to 100 years. How do you do that? How can you possibly look ahead 50 years when the last 20 years, the last 50 years, has had the kind of change that we've seen? How do you imagine a future that has a level of change that's consonant with what has occurred since 1980? It's an unbelievably daunting task.